December 1944, the Hürtgen Forest. A 22-year-old private from Wisconsin crouches behind a shattered pine tree, his hands shaking so badly he cannot load his rifle. 30 meters ahead, a German soldier emerges from a concrete bunker, arms raised in surrender. On his back, twin metal cylinders connected by rubber hoses. The private does not hesitate. He raises his M1 Garand and fires. The German drops. No one says a word, no one reports it, no one is punished. That German soldier was carrying a Flammenwerfer, the weapon that turned men into screaming torches. He had just used it to incinerate 3 Americans in a foxhole. The private watched his friends burn alive, heard them scream as their flesh melted from their bones. When the German ran out of fuel and raised his hands, the laws of war said he should be taken prisoner. The private from Wisconsin did not care about the laws of war, he cared about justice. And in that forest, in that moment, justice came from the barrel of a rifle. This is the story of the German flamethrower, a weapon so horrific that both sides developed an unwritten rule about the men who carried it. A rule that said some weapons put you outside the protection of surrender. A rule that said if you chose to burn men alive, you forfeited your right to mercy. The story begins not in the frozen forests of Germany, but in the mud and wire of an earlier war, where engineers first learnt to weaponize humanity's oldest fear. This is not a celebration of the weapon or the regime that wielded it. It is an attempt to understand why ordinary men, on both sides, committed acts that haunted them for the rest of their lives. The flamethrower reveals something uncomfortable about the nature of warfare itself, about the line between acceptable and unacceptable killing, and about what happens when that line is crossed. The flamethrower did not begin as a weapon of terror, it began as an engineering solution to an impossible military problem. To understand why Germany invested so heavily in flame warfare, we must return to the trenches of 1915, where the Western Front had become a maze of concrete, barbed wire, and machine gun nests that conventional weapons could not overcome. The problem facing German commanders was straightforward to describe and seemingly impossible to solve. French and British troops had constructed defensive positions reinforced with steel and concrete that could withstand artillery bombardment for days. Machine gun crews sat behind walls a meter thick, waiting for infantry assaults that never reached them. Grenades bounced off fortified positions. Rifle fire was useless against bunker slits. And every frontal assault produced casualty figures that shocked even generals hardened by years of industrial slaughter. The numbers from the Western Front told a story of strategic deadlock. During the Battle of the Somme in 1916, British forces suffered 57,000 casualties on the first day alone. The average advance that year was measured in meters, not kilometers. German defensive doctrine had evolved to create interlocking fields of fire that made conventional infantry assault virtually suicidal. Something had to change. The trenches had become impregnable, and the men who defended them had become untouchable. German military engineers studied the problem from every angle. They needed a weapon that could reach inside fortifications, something that could kill defenders without requiring a direct line of fire, something that would clear a bunker in seconds rather than hours. The answer came from an unlikely source, a Berlin engineer named Richard Fiedler who had been experimenting with pressurized fuel systems since 1901. Fiedler had actually demonstrated his device to the German military in 1901, but peacetime generals saw no use for such a weapon. War changed their minds. By 1914, Fiedler's concept was elegant in its brutality. Compress flammable liquid in a tank, pressurize it with nitrogen, and project it through a nozzle ignited by a hydrogen flame. The result was a stream of burning fuel that could reach 25 meters, curve around corners, flow through bunker slits, and fill enclosed spaces with fire hot enough to melt steel. On February 26, 1915, German troops deployed Fiedler's creation against British positions near Malancourt in the Verdun sector. The results exceeded every expectation. Defenders who had withstood weeks of shelling abandoned their positions in seconds. Many did not make it out at all. The British official history recorded that the attack caused panic entirely disproportionate to the actual casualties inflicted. Fire, it seemed, broke something in men that bullets could not touch. The numbers tell the story of what happened next. Germany formed dedicated flamethrower units under Captain Bernhard Redemann, a former firefighter who understood both the potential and the danger of weaponized flame. Redemann was a perfectionist who personally supervised the training of every operator. He established criteria that remained in place throughout both world wars. Not everyone, he wrote, had the steady nerves and strong stomach required for this work. He recruited former firefighters who understood pumping equipment and pressure systems. He selected men who could remain calm while carrying tanks of explosive fuel into enemy fire. By 1916, Redemann commanded over 3,000 men organized into 12 companies. These troops received a distinctive insignia after their 150th successful flame attack, the Totenkopf, the death's head skull that symbolized both the death they dealt and the death they faced. Redemann's Flammenwerfer troops recorded 890 deaths during 4 years of operation, a casualty rate far exceeding regular infantry. The men who carried fire into battle understood they were unlikely to survive the war. The Great War established the fundamental truth about flamethrower warfare that would persist into the next conflict. The weapon was devastatingly effective against fortified positions, and the men who operated it were marked for death by enemy fire during the attack and by enemy hands if they survived long enough to surrender. British and French troops quickly learned to identify the distinctive silhouette of the flamethrower operator and to concentrate all available fire on that single target. Those who survived the initial assault faced the hatred of men who had watched their comrades burn. The British developed their own flamethrowers in response, deploying the Livens Large Gallery flame projector in 1916. This massive weapon could project flame over 90 meters but required extensive preparation and could only be used from fixed positions. The French introduced the Schilt flamethrower, a more portable design that saw action at Verdun, but none of these Allied weapons achieved the tactical integration that German Sturmpioneer demonstrated. Germany had invented flame warfare and remained its most accomplished practitioner. The Flammenwerfer 35 entered Wehrmacht service in 1935, representing 2 decades of refinement since the First World War. German engineers had addressed every weakness identified in combat while preserving the fundamental killing mechanism that made the weapon so effective. The new design reflected lessons learned in Blood and Fire. The technical specifications reveal a weapon optimized for assault operations against prepared defenses. The complete system weighed 35.8 kilograms when fully loaded, distributed across a frame designed to be carried by a single operator. 2 cylinders rode on the soldier's back, one containing 11.8 litres of Flamel No. 19, a mixture of petrol and tar that burned with a thick black smoke and adhered to any surface it touched. The second cylinder held pressurized nitrogen at 15 atmospheres, providing the force to project fuel through 30 meters of hostile air. The ignition system relied on a hydrogen torch mounted at the nozzle tip, sparked by a battery-powered electrical system. When the operator squeezed the trigger, nitrogen pressure forced fuel through the line and past the burning hydrogen, creating a jet of flame that could sustain continuous fire for approximately 10 seconds, or be released in shorter bursts lasting 1 to 2 seconds each. An experienced operator could deliver 10 to 15 controlled bursts before exhausting his fuel supply. The weapon's effective range varied between 25 and 30 meters, depending on wind conditions and fuel pressure. The flammel itself deserves particular attention because it explains why flamethrower wounds were so uniquely horrific. Unlike pure petrol, which burns hot but dissipates quickly, the tar mixture created a substance that stuck to skin, clothing, and equipment while burning at temperatures approaching 1500 degrees Celsius. Victims could not simply drop and roll to extinguish the flames. The burning fuel clung to them, continuing to consume flesh even as they fled, even as they screamed, even as they died. Medical officers on both sides reported that flamethrower casualties were among the most difficult to treat, with survival rates far below those for conventional burns. German tactical doctrine specified that Flammenwerfer operators work in 8-man assault teams. 2 men carried the flamethrowers themselves, protected by 6 riflemen and grenadiers whose job was to suppress enemy fire during the critical approach phase. The black smoke produced by burning flammel served a secondary tactical purpose, creating a screen that allowed following infantry to advance behind the flame attack. Speed was essential. The 20 to 30 meter effective range meant operators had to close within small arms distance of enemy positions. Every second of exposure increased the likelihood of being killed before reaching firing range. The Flammenwerfer 41 addressed the 35's greatest weakness, its excessive weight. Combat experience in Poland and France demonstrated that 35 kilograms was simply too heavy for extended operations, particularly in difficult terrain. Engineers reduced the loaded weight to approximately 22 kilograms while maintaining range and fuel capacity. The 41 also introduced an improved fuel valve that allowed more precise control over burst duration and spread pattern. The reduction in weight came primarily from improved cylinder manufacturing techniques and a redesigned frame that distributed the load more efficiently. But the Russian winter of 1941-42 exposed a flaw that German engineers had not anticipated. The hydrogen ignition system, so reliable in temperate conditions, failed catastrophically when temperatures dropped below -20 degrees Celsius. Operators squeezed their triggers and nothing happened. The hydrogen froze in its lines, the electrical systems failed, men died carrying weapons that would not fire. In the brutal cold outside Moscow, flamethrower teams discovered that their most devastating weapon had become 35 kilograms of useless steel and rubber. German intelligence officers studying captured Soviet flamethrowers discovered a solution. The Russian ROKS flamethrower used a cartridge ignition system, essentially a blank cartridge that fired when the trigger was pulled, creating a flame to ignite the fuel stream. The Flammenwerfer 42 incorporated this design, replacing the hydrogen torch with a 10-round magazine of 9mm blank cartridges. The modification worked. Flamethrowers fired reliably even in the brutal cold of the Eastern Front. Each magazine provided 10 ignition attempts, more than enough for a single combat action. Production figures reveal the scale of German investment in flame warfare. Between 1942 and 1945, German factories manufactured between 64,000 and 70,000 Flammenwerfer 41 and 42 units. An additional 50,000 Abwehr Flammenwerfer 42 static defensive weapons were produced for installation along the Atlantic Wall and other fortified positions. These static weapons could be buried along defensive lines and detonated remotely, creating walls of flame to break up infantry assaults. Approximately 1,300 flamethrowers were allocated to Axis allies, including Italy, Romania, and Hungary. Late in the war, desperate shortages led to the Einstoss Flammenwerfer 46, a single-shot disposable unit weighing just 2.9 kilograms, designed to be manufactured cheaply and issued to Volkssturm militia units with minimal training. This weapon could project flame for only half a second to 2 seconds, just enough to clear a single room or position. Between 15,000 and 30,000 were produced in the final months of the war, testimony to Germany's determination to use every available weapon in the defense of the Reich. The Germans also developed vehicle-mounted flame systems. The SD KFZ-25116 was a half-track mounting 2 Flammenwerfer units with internal fuel tanks holding several hundred litres. These vehicles could support infantry assaults while providing the crew with armoured protection that portable operators could never achieve. 6 such vehicles were allocated to each Pioniersturm-Bataillon by late 1944. The Flammpanzer III, based on the Panzer III chassis, carried approximately 1,000 litres of fuel and could project flame to 60 metres. Roughly 100 were produced before the programme was cancelled in favour of more conventional armoured vehicles. The battlefield reality of flame warfare bore little resemblance to the clean engineering specifications in German technical manuals. In practice, the Flammenwerfer was a weapon that killed its operators almost as efficiently as it killed its targets. The men who carried these devices into combat faced dangers that no amount of training could fully prepare them for. Every enemy soldier at the front was on the lookout for flamethrower teams. The distinctive silhouette of the twin cylinders made operators immediate priority targets for every rifle, machine gun, and mortar within range. Snipers specifically hunted for the telltale shape. Artillery forward observers called fire missions on suspected flamethrower positions. The moment an operator revealed himself, concentrated fire converged on his location. Veterans recalled that the appearance of a flamethrower team transformed the dynamics of combat immediately. All other concerns became secondary to destroying that single soldier. The fuel tanks themselves presented a complex vulnerability. Hollywood films depict flamethrowers exploding dramatically when struck by bullets, but the reality was more nuanced. The fuel mixture did not detonate like explosives. A bullet penetrating the tank would cause a leak, certainly. If the operator was actively firing when hit, the leaking fuel might ignite, engulfing him in his own flames. But a tank that was not under pressure, or fuel that leaked away from the ignition source, would simply drain away. The greater danger was the nitrogen cylinder. A puncture in the pressurized gas tank could cause catastrophic failure, rupturing the entire system and potentially killing the operator through blast effect alone. Combat accounts from both sides describe the particular horror of watching flame attacks unfold. American veterans of the Hürtgen Forest campaign recalled the sound first, a distinctive whooshing roar unlike any other weapon. Then came the visual, a jet of orange and black that seemed to reach across impossible distances. And then came the screaming. Men who survived flame attacks carried those sounds with them for the rest of their lives. The screams of burning men, they reported, were different from any other sound on the battlefield, higher pitched, more desperate, and they continued for what seemed like an eternity. A 1945 symposium at Dumbarton Oaks, organised by the United States Chemical Warfare Service, documented the physiological effects of flamethrower attacks with clinical precision that somehow made the horror worse. Death from direct flame contact occurred within a minute, but many victims did not die from burns at all. In enclosed spaces like bunkers and pillboxes, the flamethrower consumed all available oxygen within seconds, causing near instantaneous unconsciousness from hypoxia. Carbon monoxide levels in a flame-attacked bunker reached lethal concentrations within minutes, killing anyone who survived the initial attack. Air temperatures inside enclosed spaces could exceed 1,000 degrees Celsius, hot enough to cause death from superheated air inhalation alone. The Symposium researchers documented that victims in such spaces died from multiple simultaneous causes. Their lungs were seared by superheated air, their blood was poisoned by carbon monoxide, their bodies were burned by direct flame contact, and they suffocated as the fire consumed all available oxygen. Death came from every direction at once. The Chemical Warfare Service had claimed in 1944 propaganda that flamethrower deaths were essentially painless, that victims lost consciousness so quickly they felt nothing. Lieutenant Colonel Orby Bostick stated publicly that the victim probably feels no pain. The Dumbarton Oaks research revealed this as deliberate misrepresentation, intended to assuage the horror young soldiers must have felt upon hearing the screams and seeing the charred remains of enemy soldiers. The truth was that flamethrower victims died in agony, those who died quickly from oxygen deprivation and those who burned more slowly outside in closed spaces alike. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. Now let us examine what the men who carried these weapons actually experienced, and the terrible bargain they made when they volunteered for flame warfare. The Sturmpioniere, Germany's assault pioneers, were primarily responsible for portable flamethrower operations throughout the war. This organisational structure reflected German doctrine that viewed flame warfare as a specialised engineering function rather than a general infantry capability. The men who carried the Flammenwerfer were not ordinary soldiers pressed into an unpleasant duty. They were specialists who volunteered for one of the war's most dangerous assignments. Wehrmacht training documents specified 16 hours of technical instruction and 8 additional hours of tactical training for flamethrower operators, but the real selection criterion was psychological. Captain Rederman had established in the First World War that not everyone had the steady nerves and strong stomach required for flame warfare. The weapon demanded operators willing to close within 30 meters of enemy positions while carrying tanks of explosive fuel. It required men capable of directing fire at human beings and watching them burn. It needed soldiers who could function effectively, knowing that capture likely meant execution. The numbers make the human cost clear. Of more than 300 American flamethrower operators deployed on Iwo Jima, fewer than 20 survived the battle. Veterans later said a flamethrower operator might last only minutes once he began his approach, because the tank made him a priority target for every enemy weapon in range. One Marine unit on Iwo Jima recorded a 92% casualty rate among its flamethrower men. German casualty figures for Sturmpionier units are harder to verify, but available evidence suggests similar devastation. The weapon that made its operators so valuable also made them the most hunted men on any battlefield. The psychological burden on survivors proved equally severe. Herschel Williams, known as Woody, received the Medal of Honor for his actions on Iwo Jima, where he single-handedly destroyed 7 Japanese pillboxes with his flamethrower over 4 hours of continuous combat. Williams later described his experience with devastating honesty. He stated that he had a tremendous amount of difficulty because he could not forgive himself for having to take so many lives in such a horrible way. The men he killed, he knew, had died in agony. That knowledge never left him. Williams suffered severe post-traumatic stress for decades after the war. He experienced recurring nightmares in which he would leap from bed, push furniture aside, and pound on the walls an imaginary wave of fire. His wife learned to stay clear when the dreams came. He coped through heavy drinking until finding religious renewal in 1962. His experience was not unique. Research confirms that American flamethrower operators frequently ended up haunted by nightmares and guilt long after the war ended. The weapon that killed their enemies also wounded them in ways that never fully healed. German flamethrower operators faced an additional psychological burden. They knew, from the moment they accepted the assignment, that the enemy would likely not take them prisoner. Wehrmacht training materials explicitly warned that operators were subject to summary execution if captured. This was not speculation or rumour. It was institutional acknowledgement of a battlefield reality that both sides understood but neither officially sanctioned. When a German Sturmpionier strapped on his Flammenwerfer, he was making a choice that could not be unmade. He was placing himself outside the protections that made surrender possible. Letters and diaries from German Sturmpionier reveal men who understood exactly what they had chosen. They wrote about the fear of being burned by their own weapons, the terror of approaching enemy positions under fire, and the knowledge that their only real options were victory or death. Surrender was not among them. Some wrote about the pride they took in their specialist status. Others expressed doubt about the morality of their weapon. Most simply focused on survival, knowing that each mission might be their last. The flamethrower operator occupied a unique position in the hierarchy of combat. He was simultaneously the most valuable and the most vulnerable soldier on the battlefield. He was essential for breaking fortified resistance and terrifying in his capacity for destruction. But he was also walking death, carrying enough fuel to turn himself into a human torch if a single bullet found the wrong target. The men who volunteered for this duty knew all of this. They volunteered anyway. The evidence that Allied soldiers killed surrendering flamethrower operators is documented, but frustratingly incomplete. The practice was widespread enough to be acknowledged in multiple sources, yet specific incidents remain rare in the historical record. This pattern itself tells us something important. The killings happened, they were simply not reported. Men who shot prisoners did not file paperwork about it. The most detailed documented incident involved British Churchill Crocodile flamethrower tank crews in Normandy. Andrew Wilson served with the 141st Regiment Royal Armoured Corps, part of the 79th Armoured Division that operated these fearsome vehicles. The Crocodile mounted a flamethrower in place of the whole machine gun, connected by an armoured hose to a trailer carrying 400 gallons of fuel. It could project flame over 120 metres, far exceeding any portable weapon. German infantry learned to fear the distinctive shape of the Crocodile and the armoured trailer it towed. Wilson recorded what happened after German forces captured a disabled Crocodile and its crew. They found Harvey's tank and the tools laid out on the ground around it. Harvey and his crew had been lined up against a farmhouse wall and shot. The incident raised an immediate question among British tankers. Would they shoot all captured crocodile crews from now on? The answer, apparently, was yes. British crocodile crews received 6p daily in additional pay, specifically classified as danger money, official recognition that the threat of arbitrary execution justified hazard compensation. There were formal Axis protests against Churchill crocodile deployment, suggesting German command recognized these weapons as somehow outside normal warfare, even as Germany itself employed flamethrowers extensively. The protests went nowhere. Both sides continued to use flame weapons. Both sides continued to kill those who surrendered while carrying them. American accounts are more scattered but equally suggestive. Veterans of the Hürtgen Forest, the Bulge, and the push into Germany itself described incidents where flamethrower operators who attempted to surrender were shot on the spot. The killings were not officially sanctioned. They were not recorded in after-action reports. They were simply things that happened, things that soldiers understood happened, things that no one spoke about afterward. In the heat of combat, with the smell of burned flesh still hanging in the air, the laws of war seemed very far away. The psychological logic behind these killings deserves examination rather than condemnation. Soldiers who had watched their friends burn alive, who had heard the screams, who had smelled the distinctive odour of burning human flesh, operated under emotional pressures that peacetime morality cannot easily judge. The flamethrower operator had chosen to wield a weapon of particular horror. When he ran out of fuel and raised his hands, he was asking for mercy from men to whom he had shown none. That some soldiers refused to grant that mercy should surprise no one. This does not make the killings legal. The Geneva Conventions protected prisoners of war regardless of what weapons they had carried. A surrendering soldier was entitled to humane treatment, whether he had been armed with a rifle or a flamethrower, but law and battlefield reality often diverged in ways that post-war courts struggled to address. Very few soldiers were ever prosecuted for killing surrendering flamethrower operators on any side. The unwritten rule that flame operators forfeited the right to surrender was never officially acknowledged, but it was universally understood. The phenomenon operated reciprocally. German troops killed captured Allied flamethrower operators just as Allied troops killed captured Germans. The weapon itself seemed to create a category of combatant for whom normal protections did not apply. Military historian Max Hastings documented that American, Canadian, and British troops routinely shot snipers and Waffen-SS prisoners on the battlefield. Flamethrower operators occupied a similar category, perhaps even worse. Snipers killed cleanly. Flamethrower operators killed by burning men alive. The distinction mattered to soldiers who had to decide, in seconds, whether to take a prisoner or pull the trigger. American forces had developed their own flamethrower doctrine after studying German equipment captured in North Africa. The M22 flamethrower became the standard American portable flame weapon, carrying about 5 gallons of thickened fuel with an effective range around 20 meters and maximum range of 40 to 45 meters. Marine Corps doctrine emphasized the corkscrew and blowtorch technique, using combined arms to suppress defenders, while flamethrower teams approached bunker apertures. The weapon proved decisive in the Pacific Island campaigns, where Japanese defenders fought from elaborate tunnel systems that conventional weapons could not penetrate. The British Churchill Crocodile represented the most powerful flame weapon deployed by any nation. Its armoured trailer carried 400 gallons of fuel that could be projected in 81-second bursts. German infantry learned to recognise the distinctive silhouette and either fled or fought with desperate intensity, knowing that flame was coming. After several crocodile crews were executed after capture, British tankers began to dread the weapon as much as their enemies did. Being assigned to a crocodile crew was understood as a potential death sentence, whether in battle or afterward. The flamethrower's legal status presents a profound contradiction between international humanitarian law and battlefield moral intuition. Despite universal recognition of its horrific effects, the weapon was never banned by any treaty in effect during the Second World War. This legal acceptance existed in stark contrast to the informal soldier codes that marked flame operators for death. The Hague Convention of 1907, Article 23, Section E, prohibits weapons calculated to cause superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering. On its face, this provision would seem to encompass the flamethrower, a weapon that kills through sustained burning, rather than the relatively quick death of gunshot wounds. Yet no international tribunal ever found that flamethrowers categorically violated this provision. The weapon remained legal throughout the war and remains legal under international law today. The Geneva Conventions of 1949, drafted after the war, focused on protecting non-combatants and prisoners, rather than prohibiting specific weapons. Only in 1980 did Protocol 3 to the Convention on certain conventional weapons restrict incendiary weapons, and even then it prohibited their use against civilians rather than banning them entirely. The United States eventually joined Protocol 3 in 2009, but with a reservation that drew formal objections from other states. The flamethrower that killed tens of thousands in the Second World War remains a legal weapon of war. Why did soldiers on both sides consider flamethrower operators as somehow outside normal protections while international law said nothing of the kind? The answer lies in what researchers studying combat psychology call informal soldier codes, the unwritten rules that combatants develop to maintain some semblance of humanity within the organized inhumanity of war. These codes have no legal force. They exist only in the minds of soldiers who must somehow reconcile the act of killing with their own sense of moral identity. These codes distinguish between acceptable and unacceptable means of killing, distinctions that had no basis in law but felt intuitively correct to the men who held them. Rifle fire was acceptable. Artillery was acceptable. Even machine guns, despite their capacity for mass slaughter, fell within the bounds of legitimate warfare. But certain weapons crossed an invisible line: poison gas, hollow point bullets, and fire. These weapons triggered something primal, a revulsion that overrode military discipline and legal obligation. The flamethrower violated these informal codes in multiple ways. It caused disproportionate suffering compared to other weapons. It killed in a manner that felt fundamentally unfair, denying victims any chance to fight back or seek cover. And it triggered humanity's primal terror of burning, a fear rooted so deeply in our evolutionary history that no amount of military training could fully suppress it. Fire has been humanity's tool and terror since before we were fully human. To use it as a weapon against other human beings felt, to many soldiers, like a violation of something fundamental. The reciprocity principle also operated powerfully. Soldiers understood that if you used certain weapons against the enemy was likely to respond in kind. But with the flamethrower, reciprocity extended beyond the battlefield. If you burned my comrades alive, the informal code suggested, you had forfeited your claim to the protections that made surrender possible. You had placed yourself outside the community of soldiers who fought each other by day and might offer cigarettes to prisoners by evening. You had become something other than an enemy combatant. You had become a target. The photograph that ended American tactical flamethrower use was taken on June 8, 1972. 9-year-old Phan Thi Kim Phuc runs naked down a road near Trang Bang, her clothes burned away by napalm dropped from a South Vietnamese aircraft. Her mouth is open in a scream. Her arms are extended in helpless agony. Behind her, soldiers walk with an indifference that makes the image even more devastating. That single photograph did what 2 world wars of flamethrower combat could not. It turned public opinion decisively against incendiary weapons. That photograph won the Pulitzer Prize and came to symbolize the horrors of the Vietnam War. It helped turn public sentiment against incendiary weapons in a way that decades of flamethrower warfare in 2 world wars had failed to achieve. By 1978, the Department of Defense had formally ceased tactical flamethrower development and use. The weapon that had been indispensable at Iwo Jima and in the Hürtgen Forest was quietly retired. But the legacy of the Flammenwerfer extends beyond policy changes. It reaches into the memories of men who wielded these weapons and the men who faced them, memories that persisted for decades after the guns fell silent. The psychological wounds inflicted by flame warfare proved as durable as any physical scar. Major General Clifton B. Cates, who commanded the 4th Marine Division on Iwo Jima and later served as Commandant of the Marine Corps, stated simply that he could not think of a more inhumane weapon. This was a man who had seen every form of violence the Pacific War could produce, who had ordered thousands of men into battle knowing many would not return. Even he recoiled from what the flamethrower represented. The veterans who used these weapons carried burdens that most of us cannot imagine. Woody Williams spent decades unable to forgive himself for the lives he had taken. He was not alone. Across America, Britain, Germany, and Japan, former flamethrower operators struggled with what they had done, what they had seen, and what had been done to them in return. Many never spoke of their experiences. Many drank to forget. Many failed. The weapon that won battles destroyed the men who carried it, even those who survived. The men who faced these weapons carried different burdens. Survivors of flame attacks bore scars that never fully healed, physical marks that reminded them daily of moments they wished they could forget. Veterans who had watched friends burn alive carried memories that surfaced in nightmares for the rest of their lives. And soldiers who had killed surrendering flamethrower operators carried the knowledge of what they had done in the heat of rage and grief. None of them escaped unchanged. General George C. Marshall defended flamethrower use during the war with a statement that cuts to the heart of the moral dilemma. The vehement protests I am receiving against our use of flamethrowers, he said, do not indicate an understanding of the meaning of our dead. He was right that the weapon saved American lives by breaking Japanese resistance that would otherwise have required far bloodier infantry assaults. He was also right that critics who condemned the weapon from comfortable distance could not fully understand the choices facing men on the ground. But Marshall's defense, however tactically sound, cannot resolve the fundamental question the flamethrower poses. Some weapons are so horrific that their effectiveness does not justify their existence. The world reached that conclusion about chemical weapons after the First World War, banning them even though they would certainly have been effective in the next conflict. The world reached that conclusion about biological weapons and nuclear weapons and cluster munitions. Should it have? reached the same conclusion about the flamethrower. The question remains unanswered. What we know is that the weapon existed, that men used it, that other men died from it in unspeakable agony, and that the men who carried it into battle were marked for a different kind of death than other soldiers faced. The unwritten rule that denied them the protection of surrender was never codified into law. It did not need to be. Every soldier understood it. The flame operator's weapon was also his death sentence. December 1944. The Hürtgen Forest. That private from Wisconsin stands over the body of the German soldier he has just killed. The man's arms are still raised in surrender. The twin cylinders of the Flammenwerfer lie beside him, empty now, harmless now, too late now for the Americans who burned. The private does not feel guilty. Not yet. That will come later, decades later, in dreams he cannot control, and memories he cannot escape. In this moment he feels only rage and grief and the terrible satisfaction of revenge. His friends are dead. The man who killed them is dead. That is all the justice war allows. 60 years later, the last surviving veterans of that campaign carry memories they have never shared with anyone. Some remember the sound of the weapon, that distinctive whooshing roar. Some remember the smell of burned flesh that no amount of time can fully erase from memory. Some remember pulling the trigger on men who had raised their hands. They do not speak of these things at reunions. They do not write about them in memoirs. They take them to their graves, secrets of a war that demanded everything from the men who fought it, including pieces of their souls they would never get back. The Flammenwerfer killed tens of thousands of Allied soldiers during the Second World War. It terrorized millions more who heard its roar and saw its flame and knew that such a death awaited them if they failed. It destroyed fortifications that no other weapon could breach and broke resistance that would otherwise have cost countless more lives to overcome, and it killed the men who carried it, in battle and in surrender alike. Because some weapons place those who wield them outside the protections that make war, if not humane, at least survivable. Some weapons say to the enemy, "I will show you no mercy," and hear in reply, then expect none in return. The German soldier lying dead in the Hürtgen Forest understood this when he volunteered for the Sturmpioneer. He understood it when he strapped on the 35-kilogram apparatus that marked him as a priority target. He understood it when he pulled the trigger and watched American soldiers burn. He understood it when he ran out of fuel and raised his hands and saw the look in the private's eyes. He understood in that final moment that the weapon on his back had already killed him. The bullet was just the confirmation.